Webcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and a warm welcome to all. We are sorry for the inconvenience because there's some system error. Because of that, we are not able to start on time. I'm Ridhil Mishra on behalf of K Ratings. Welcome you to our today's webinar on Indian economy, COVID impact. Appreciate your time in joining us for this webinar. Our speaker for today is Mr. Mehul Pandya, who's the Executive Director at K Ratings. Along with him, we have Mr. Madan, Chief Economist at K Ratings. In about a minute or so, I'll just request Mehul sir to begin the proceedings. Yeah, Mehul sir, if you could please begin the session.
Sure. Thanks, Mehul. Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar on the impact of COVID-19 on the Indian economy. COVID-19 has succeeded in removing the demarcation between the developed and the developing world, those with sophisticated healthcare system and those fledgling alike. It has struck with a deadly venom on most countries of the world, with the impact hard to segregate between nations. The global as well as Indian economy were already facing headwinds even prior to the onset of COVID-19. The pandemic has exacerbated it to the levels beyond the possibility of a concrete prognosis at this juncture. For India, this could not have come at a worse time. With successive quarters of declining GDP growth, large sections of the economy were already gasping to stay afloat. Devastated as they were by the successive events like demonetization, GST stabilization issues, challenges in the financial sector, and the overall slowdown in demand for many sectors, the corporates had been urging for urgent corrective measures. In this backdrop, it is one of the most difficult tasks to predict what potential course the economy can take. At best, we could have different scenarios to work out the probable impact. While my colleague and our chief economist, Madan Sabnavis, shall delve deeper into these aspects, I would like to put across the major points. Prolonged lockdown shall significantly impact the non-essential consumption, and public shall be extremely wary of undertaking any discretionary expenditure. Sectors such as entertainment, hospitality, white goods, clothing, etc. could be significantly impacted. Sectors dependent on labor force shall take a long time to come back to normal level of operations, considering the disruption caused in the supply of labor and the time for the labor force to return back to their workplaces. Considering the major share of China in supply of inputs for many industries, shortages could result in less than optimal output for a reasonably long period. Sectors such as solar that are dependent on China for import of the panels could see significant markdown of the targeted installed capacities. Sectors like electrical machinery and chemicals may also see supply side issues. Despite the moratorium announced by RBI, corporates could face significant cash flow mismatches, and managing the working capital requirements shall be the key challenge. While infrastructure could likely remain Government of India's focus area in the terms of reviving the growth in the post-lockdown scenario, it could take time to mobilize labor, and by that time, monsoon may also set in. Hence, the traction on infra side could be seen only towards the end of Q2. For the financial sector, which was already reeling under challenges, it could face further headwinds, and this time on the asset side. RBI's measures notwithstanding, it remains to be seen whether the banks dilute the selective approach in extending credit. Mutual funds may continue to stay away from the sector. Securitization which had been the mainstay for the sector to raise liquidity over the last 18 months or so, could witness a pause with collections getting impacted during moratorium. Lack of clarity as to whether mutual funds may agree or not on the moratorium in PTC payouts only adds to the uncertainty. Delinquencies are most likely to rise post the moratorium in the securitization transactions. However, asset classes may behave differently. Other factors that may influence include level of amortization of the pool, credit enhancement available as compared to the balance payable to the investors, etc. The TLTRO2 and refinancing from NABARD, SIDBI, and NHB could provide some comfort. However, the key to survival shall be the measures to meet the asset side challenges. For those who do not get moratorium from banks or are unable to raise additional long-term funds, liquidity buffers may start depleting. Overall, the impact on individual NBFCs or HFCs shall be critically dependent on their operating profile in terms of the geographies and borrower types. More than anything else, what matters at this juncture is how the lockdown could be lifted. The approach could be varying from state to state, and even within the state, it could differ from district to district depending on the severity index of each area. While containment zones are monitored during lockdown, the post-lockdown phase shall see the requirement of close monitoring of entire cities, towns, and districts. Besides, a probable reverse migration of workers to their home states once the lockdown is lifted due to lack of activity levels in cities could pose a big challenge for the government as well as for the sectors that are dependent on them. Given the sharp fall in consumption and investment, it will be a Herculean task for the government to bring the economy back and running, given the pace of the spread of the pandemic and wherein its total eradication seems quite uncertain. The government is faced with a double whammy, where the question lies within prioritizing the health of the economy versus health of the nation, and when exactly the former takes precedence over the latter as the days pass by. It is going to be a wait and watch for everybody to see how effectively India will be able to flatten the corona curve in the coming few weeks. For the credit rating agencies also, assessment of credit quality during as well as the post-moratorium phase could pose a significant challenge. While the extent of downgrades cannot be predicted, what is certain is that the year FY21 is certainly going to be one of the most challenging for anyone associated with the credit risk assessment, be it the lenders, investors, or the credit rating agencies. I now request Madan to take over the proceedings.
Yeah, thanks, Mehul, and good afternoon to everyone. I think Mehul has taken us through all the salient features or the salient factors which one needs to look at when you're trying to analyze the effect of this pandemic on the Indian economy. Now, I think one of the questions which keeps coming continuously to economists is what is growth going to be like? And I think we've also been sort of grappling with this particular issue to say as to what kind of a number can we really come up with. And what we've realized is that to form any kind of a view about how the economy is going to grow, there are very, what's important is really the kind of assumptions which we make. And I think this is one of the reasons as to why even the RBI in the last two policies have stayed away from making any projection, which I think is fairly practical because we really didn't know as to whether there would be an extension of the lockdown or not. Initially, we all felt it would be 3 weeks. Now they've extended up to May. And even on May 3rd, we're not quite sure if it's going to be extended by another month or a couple of weeks. And as what Mehul has pointed out, it's going to differ across various states. So even on May 3rd, in case it's withdrawn, we will have to wait and see as to what kind of restrictions remain in terms of activity activity across different regions of the country. So therefore, it becomes a bit difficult for one to really come up with a number. Now, I think one thing which has been useful for us, some kind of a guiding light, has been what the IMF has come up with last week in the World Economic Outlook, where they have provided a number of 1.9% for 2021. And in fact, they're talking of something over 7.5% for 21-22. And this number of 1.9% has been put into perspective of being one of the best growing rates for 2021, which is slightly heartening also given the fact that the United Nations towards the end of March also said that India and China would be two countries which would be growing, while there would be a recession in most of the other nations. And the IMF's numbers also showed the very same thing. So what are we really looking at? Maybe what the IMF is talking of is 1.9%. My team and I, we are trying to get together certain numbers. Hopefully by the end of this week, we are going to stick our necks out and come up with some kind of a number. And prima facie, it looks like that the number would be probably lower than 1.9%, even in the best of situation, because we keep making assumptions that things could return to normalcy in the second half. I think that's the kind of an assumption which even the IMF has made. But we should remember that two important things which have to be straightened out in the process of normalization. I think points which have been touched upon by Mehul already are labor and transportation. Because we have seen a large amount of people have lost their jobs. People have gone in for pay cuts. You give up a month's salary or 2 months' salary or whatever it is. Labor has been let go, which also means that there's been large-scale migration or attempted migration from the urban to the rural areas of work.
So sorry to interrupt you. There's a voice is a bit garbled, sir. I think there's some network issue at your end.
We should remember that even when the lockdown is removed, I think when you're going to maintain norms of social normalization. And we've also seen that on account of communication being fairly weak or interpreted, 30 months stable. Let me do one thing. Okay, is it better now, Mridul?
Yeah, I think we missed out about a couple of minutes. Sir, hello.
Hello.
Yeah, I think we missed out a couple of minutes before. The voice was garbled. Yeah, could you yeah, try it once more, sir, please? Hello.
Yeah, because I've taken out my earphones, so I think I'm talking directly in.
Yeah, now it's okay.
Now?
Yeah. I think we can rewind about a minute or two.
Because I removed my earphone.
Madan, you can rewind from the point of your own, our team's prognosis from what IMF's 1.9% forecast is. So from that point on, you can just summarize and then move on.
Okay. So when we are making any kind of a forecast about when things are going to normalize, I think the two things which we will have to look at is migration, or rather the reverse migration, because the moment the lockdown was announced, we had seen that a large number of the migrant labor force, which comes under typically the casual labor, which was laid off, had decided to move back to the villages because of the absence of any regular income. And this particular group will have to come back into place. And for such a thing to happen, I think what's really important is that we need to make sure that a transportation system is in place. Because when we're talking of labor moving in and out, I think what really came in the way was the close down of the railways, the close down of the state transport buses. And I think that's something which has to be reversed, which to my mind is probably the biggest challenge, because even when we have normalization, we should remember that social distancing is going to be the norm. And when we talk of social distancing, it's very, very difficult to practically implement it once you have public transportation. So I think these are going to be the problems the moment we decide to normalize in a phased manner, calibrated manner, whichever way it is. Now, when we're looking in terms of what kind of a GDP growth rate can we look at? If you had missed what I said we are still working on it, but we do expect that the number will probably be less optimistic than the 1.9% number. Probably towards the end of the week, we may come up with a number after making certain assumptions, which of course are liable to change depending upon how this lockdown process moves across in the country. Now, how do we actually look at how the growth prospects? So what I'm going to do now is generally take you through what is going to lead to the GDP growth, what is going to be the impact on government finances, what is going to happen to the banking sector, interest rates, and lastly, just about touch upon what's happening to the exchange rate. I think that should probably encompass almost all the economic variables which come into discussion when we're talking of the COVID impact. Now, when you're looking at GDP growth, I think even when this issue of 1.9% of IMF came up, I think there was a lot of skepticism in the media. And there were questions which came saying that is 1.9% reasonable, or is it being a bit too far-fetched? Now, for this, we get back into the numbers of GDP and say, where does GDP come from for the economy? We basically look at 8 specific sectors and then see what kind of growth takes place. Let me take you through one by one. Now, first one is agriculture. Now, one thing about agriculture is that agriculture is actually fairly immune when it comes to COVID virus impact, because production numbers are quite different from the consumption numbers. So I think very often we tend to confuse saying that, look, I am not getting supplies of vegetables, I'm not getting supply of pulses in my market, which of course is a fact. But when you're calculating GDP, I think everything goes in terms of production as to what kind of area has been covered, what the satellites show as could be the likely production. We subtract for what could be caused, what damages could be caused due to weather disturbances, and finally come up with a number. So even the fact that the IMD is also positive, is going to be a good monsoon this year, it's fairly reasonable for one to assume that agricultural production will be more or less on target, and we could be looking at a positive growth rate. Now, how positive it will be will, of course, depend upon the Rabi harvest, which is on the way right now, because the farmers need to have a certain kind of income before they can really start investing for the Kharif harvest. So therefore, agriculture is going to be one of the positive sectors for the coming year. If we look at mining, I think mining is primarily, if we're looking at something like coal, which will be related a lot to the power sector, what happens to the other industries which use coal as a raw material. Things are going to be very much subdued. The power sector could probably be doing slightly better because there'll always be household consumption, which is there. There will be industrial production taking up probably from the second half or so. So very kind of an anemic kind of growth in the mining sector and the electricity sector will probably still be more in the positive. Manufacturing, of course, is the important thing, because I think that's the one with most employment. It also provides the kind of the basic investment which takes place in the country. And it also provides a very fair idea about where really the economy is going. And I think Mehul has already mentioned about a number of sectors which would get affected adversely, some positively. But the positive ones which we're looking at are things like food products, the FMCG, non-food products. We're looking at drugs and pharmaceuticals. These are the ones who are probably going to do fairly well, grow in the region of close to 10%, because these are things where which are considered to be essential commodities. There's been a lot of focus which has been put on these particular industries, and therefore there can be positive growth taking place. If you look at other things like consumer durable goods, which includes even the automobile sector, I don't think there is going to be too much of positive growth. What we are looking at is really staring at negative growth rates in these particular segments what normally constitutes the discretionary spending of households, because it's not just the case of production being down, it's also about the consumption ability, which is going to get impacted primarily on account of the fact that uh, people's incomes are not going to increase. People have the spending power when it comes to October, November, which is normally the time when consumers tend to spend. So therefore, I think consumer goods industries have been down. If I look at engineering, which is what comprises the capital goods, that's something which is again going to be more in a negative zone. We should remember one thing, that it'll take a long time before private sector investment really picks up. And I would tend to think, again, be only in the second half, that is the best possible scenario. The first quarter could be a washout, second quarter could be a kind of phase in which there could be certain thoughts being put in place. And I think interestingly out here, we need to point out that if you look at the RBI data on capacity utilization, this of course is for December 2019, it is around 68%. So a capacity utilization threshold, which should ideally be around 70–80% before we go in for fresh investments, is well below the mark, and therefore we cannot see any kind of a generic increase in investment. It's going to be more or less restricted to certain sectors on the private sector side, especially when it comes to the second half. Now, here it's interesting to note that I think the government has also made certain announcements for the first quarter, saying that they will not be going in for any capital expenditure. And most of the departments have seen that budgets have been pruned. And only expenditures which are going to take place will be directed towards helping the poor people. So when we're talking of the 1.7 lakh crores of fiscal relief which was provided by the central government, I think whichever departments get involved in that would be spending. So there will not be the capex activity coming from central government. Remember that in case when government decides to go in for capital expenditure, they want to construct a road, there will always be a question of saying, do I have the labor? Do I have the steel? Do I have the cement? Do I have all the other raw materials going to make a road? So I think all these pieces have to fit together, which again one can say, I mean, at best it happened in the second half, not in the first half. Which comes back to the thing of saying that the fourth segment, which we call construction, is something which is also going to lag. And we don't see too much of activity out here, maybe in economic growth 1 or 2%. Nothing more is what we can really say from the construction sector. To finish with the physical activity, let's look at the services sector. I think what you pointed out from Mehul is very pertinent, because when you look at the services sector, I think that's been affected quite deeply. And the moment we had the lockdown, I would say that even maybe a couple of weeks before the lockdown, a number of services, especially if you look at hotels, you look at restaurants, you look at tourism, you look at aviation, media, entertainment, all these were the segments which had already started rolling back activity. Now, given the fact that any kind of movement away from the shutdown back to normalcy, social distancing, all these services mean human beings are closer to each other. So it's going to take a very long time before normalcy really sets in. So when you're looking at things like transportation, hotels, we're talking of trade. Even if you look at trade, for example, lots of these mandis today are in the shutdown mode because of fear of the spread of the virus. So we have seen even the Vashi Mandi here in outside Mumbai, which is one of the major centers from where we get our essentials. We have similar news coming from many other places. So I think this segment of services is definitely going to be in a negative territory, if at all, even though there could be a recovery which could come in the second half of the year. Yes, I think this has been another blooming star, I would say, because all of us, including we people in the rating industry, we have realized that it's very much possible to work from home. I think we look at the banking activity, it's going on as usual. While we may not have to visit the banks, I think all of us have reinvented ourselves, the way we conduct our lives. And we have been going and doing everything online. We've avoided physical contact with the branch. So that banking services, I think that is something which has been going on in the normal things. Banking and financial services is something which would be registering positive growth. Then we have the real estate segment. Here we can say quite unequivocally that it's going to be negative growth out here, because this is one segment that will take a long time to recover, because it requires labor to come back, it requires confidence in the economy, it requires spending power. So notwithstanding the fact that the RBI has invoked certain measures to make sure that any defaults on the EMIs are not going to be treated as NPAs. I'll be talking about this a little later on when I'm talking about the banking sector. But overall, I think we believe that the real estate sector will be down for quite some time. And then we have the last sector, the segment called the government sector. And I think this is going to be the fastest growing sector in the economy. The way I'm defining the calculation is that look at overall expenditure of the central government minus the interest payments. But that is something which could be growing. And when I talk of fiscal slippage in the next section, you will get an idea about how critical government revenue expenditure is going to be to drive the GDP. So putting these elements of agriculture, you put the banking, you put FMCGs, you put pharmaceuticals, maybe a little bit of consumerism which could pick up, pent-up demand picking up in the second half, and very, very aggressive spending by the government. It's something which could get us into the positive region. The positive region may not definitely be above 1.9%. In fact, 10 days back when I could stick my neck out, give a number, I said not more than 3%. That was before we knew of the extension. But now with this extension coming through, and we know very well that it's going to take a much longer time before normalcy is realized, one can say we could be looking at more in the region of around 1%, provided all these things fall in place. So that is as far as the growth scenario is concerned. How about inflation? I think inflation would really not matter too much from the point of view of policy, because the RBI has already taken a stance that reviving the economy is most important. More than revival, I would say sustaining the economy, making sure that we don't sink further is more important. And therefore, all the monetary policy action has been fairly agnostic to what's happening on the inflation side. But on inflation, what kind of a view do we have? We feel that if you look at the inflation, let's look at the CPI inflation number. There are two components, the food components and the non-food components. The non-food components will continue to remain fairly benign. So we're looking at a number of less than 4%. However, food inflation, to my mind, would continue to be high, in the region of around 8 to 10%. So that on an average basis, we could still be looking at the CPI inflation in the region of around 5 to 6%. The RBI has, of course, said in their policy announced a couple of days back, I think that was on Friday, that was mentioned that they do expect inflation to come down to 4% by September. We would have a slightly different view because of the fact that there are shortages, there is an artificial increase in prices, and as of today, I think the latest CPI numbers which came out, it was not fully covered, because in the sense that we did not have all the markets covered, information was not available on all goods. Yeah, but we believe that 5 to 6% is the kind of an inflation rate we can look at least up to the month of September. If it comes down to 4%, all of us will definitely be very glad, because it will mean consumption power price, real purchasing power will be up, but probably that could give a further impetus to the RBI when it comes on the policy front. That's on inflation. Now, if I talk about the fiscal side, I think the fiscal is going to be probably the biggest problem from the point of view of policy, because we started off the year saying that we're going to have a fiscal deficit ratio of 3.5%. We assume that the GDP growth, which is the base, is going to be around 225 lakh crore rupees. Given the kind of numbers which we're talking of today, of 1-2% real growth, maybe another 5-6% of inflation. I'm not talking of nominal growth in GDP being more than 7 to 8% at best of times. It had looked at a number of around 11 to 12%, which means that my denominator is going to get squeezed any which way. Now, what about the government is going to have major challenges this year, because when we talk of an economy which has slowed down, shut down for 1 month for certain, that is April, for this particular fiscal year. There's another 10 days of the previous month, maybe something going ahead. Just look at it. For GST, we keep saying that we have this thumb rule of saying 1 lakh crores of GST collections per month. Now, if I'm talking of 1 month of shutdown, it could be virtually minimal. I would say not more than 20% of this 1 lakh crores can actually be collected, because all the services are shut down. They garner a lot of revenue for the government. Manufacturing goods, except for your food products, quite a few of them are out of your GST regime. So therefore, logically, one can say that there will be a big shortfall when it comes to GST, even as we unwind and the economy moves towards normalcy. Look at corporate taxation. I think lots of companies have stopped functioning. We're looking at manufacturing. The manufacturing sector has stopped functioning for 1 month, and it could be for another 2 months in a phased manner. Now, this was something which targeted. This was something which is going to get replicated again. We're talking of job losses, which means income tax collections could also be lower. We're talking of global trade coming to a standstill, because internationally, all ports, airports are closed. There's nothing which is going on, nothing much going on except essential commodities. With imports, we could expect custom collections also to come down. So we have a case of saying that my entire tax revenue basket which is supposed to be in the region of around 23, 24 lakh crores if I include all the taxes, it's not going to be achieved. There could be a shortfall of around 15 to 20%. Now, at the beginning of the year, we went in for this very ambitious investment program of 2 lakh crores. Will this investment really take place under these circumstances? The answer is probably not, because there is this chunk of LIC of 1 lakh crores, which was always going to be a challenge. We need to get the right valuation. We were talking of Air India getting going onto the auction block. Really be sold. We're talking of the aviation industry being affected most perversely in this particular year. So in this kind of a situation, can Air India really get a good valuation in a wobbly stock market? Let's assume that the stock market becomes normal by October. Can you really think of any aviation company doing well on account of this entire pandemic? So I think Air India cannot go through. You look at BPCA, where we were thinking of the government fully getting out of it, with prices being where they are, a gloomy world economy, because internationally the IMF are saying there's going to be a global recession, which means no demand. This also means that the oil companies are going to not do well. If they're not going to do well, you will not be getting a right valuation in the market. So there's going to be a slippage also on disinvestment, notwithstanding the fact that we are talking in terms of the government not really talking of any kind of slippages right now, but we are saying tax revenue collections will not be happening. We will not be having disinvestment taking place. The government has spoken of 1.7 lakh crores of relief program, which is over and above the fiscal numbers which were put in the 2021 budget. That was what was stated by the finance minister, which means when expenditure goes up, assuming that we do some kind of cutting of capex towards the end of the year, we could be expecting a slippage of at least 1.5 to 2% of GDP. I'm still keeping the denominator at around 225 lakh crores. So we're talking of 3.5% becoming something closer towards 5.5%. Add to this the state governments. I think lots of state governments will be keen on looking for some kind of allowances being made by the center and the RBI in terms of their FRBM norms. Just for your information, state governments are more rigidly stuck to this number of 3% fiscal deficit, because the FRBM norms say very clearly that state governments will not go beyond 3% or 3.5%, whatever is agreed between the center and the states. But under these conditions, it's quite possible that there could be some relaxation taking place out here, which means that the 3% could also be moving towards around 4.5%, which means that overall the fiscal numbers are going to be in a mess this year. Is it right or wrong? To my mind, it's absolutely right, because right now the case is, how do you bring about survival of the economy? How do you help in the survival of human beings? So if the government has to spend as much as it's required, it may be worth it. In fact, the general consensus that even if I have a combined fiscal deficit of over 10%, it's not really a bad thing. Because if you look at the kind of stimulus programs which have been provided by some of the other countries, they're all in double-digit areas. Fiscal stimulus comes in different forms. Fiscal is only one part of it. But if we're talking in terms of additional spending of another 5% of GDP, over and above the 3.5 plus 3% of state governments, I don't think it'll be a bad thing for a country like ours, which definitely requires more resources given the kind of structure of the economy that we have. Next, when we come to the monetary part of it, there are two parts to it. I think the Reserve Bank has been harping on two aspects in their last two policies. One is, of course, in terms of pure monetary policy, where the focus has been on lowering interest rates and improving transmission, making sure that funds are available to everybody who requires them. What the RBI has done, first you tried lowering the repo rate to 4.4%. You brought the reverse repo rate to 4%. But what we saw was that the banks still were putting in 4 lakh crores of their surplus funds in the net reverse repo auctions. I'm calling it net because reverse repo, you're putting on 7 lakh crores. There's been lots of open market operations. There's term LTROs, TLTROs, which have been happening also, the targeted ones. All these things combined together, we're having a surplus liquidity of around 4 lakh crores. Now, what RBI realized that how do you actually nudge banks to lend? So what they've done now is they've reduced the reverse repo rate to 3.75%. The reason being that if you bring it down to such a low rate, banks will be inspired or they'll be forced to keep lending to the commercial sector rather than putting money in this one. But bankers, of course, get a different view that bankers are still a bit apprehensive about lending, because you always feel that right now there have been a number of concessions which have been given for non-payment of dues. So that's the second part which the RBI has brought about, saying that you have this moratorium of 3 months, these coming through. But at the end of the day, the money has to be returned, because we're not talking in terms of waivers. We're talking of quite a amount of companies or units which are actually closing down. So the bankers have a genuine problem of saying that, okay, for 3 months we have brought about a government. Maybe there could be a further extension taking place of another month, 2 months, 3 months. But finally, when we say that the money has to be repaid and the companies are not able to repay it, there is this major threat that the NPA numbers will actually shoot up. So I think this is a concern which bankers have, and that's one of the reasons as to why they have not been lending this money, even though there are surplus funds. Because of course, we saying there's not too much demand for funds, but even in terms of the willingness of banks to lend, I think that's very much curtailed. So, of course, it depends upon how the banks actually react to this latest thing of the RBI on Friday, whether they would continue to lend or not. Now, because we've also noticed that when they had TLTROs which came in, where they first said that the 1 lakh crores which is going to be given has to go into the market, 50,000 into primary, 50,000 into the secondary market, where they've said that it should go into commercial paper and corporate bonds. What we realized is that they were preferring to put their money for public sector units or very highly rated papers. Now the RBI is saying under the TLTRO, the second round, 50,000 crores has to go to NBFCs. They have not really mentioned primary and secondary this time. We assume the same 50% ratio holds. But you have to put 50% of the amount has to go to the medium and small size NBFCs who are investment grade. Now it'll be interesting for us to see as to whether will the funds still go only to the better rated NBFCs, or will it also go to the lower rated NBFCs, which typically in the bond market, if you don't have a AA or a AAA, it becomes difficult for you to really mobilize investors. What do we expect from the RBI? I think the RBI is not going to really look at the inflation numbers. So I think the CPI inflation number will be fairly irrelevant. And what we'll have to really see is how the economy really gets back into shape. And if required, I think we can be looking at the RBI lowering the interest rates further, maybe by another 25 to 40 basis points during the next 3 months. I'm not quite sure if it will do it in June, because it could be done even before June. Because in case we are talking about the shutdown stopping in a limited manner on May 3rd and things returning to normalcy, I'm quite sure the RBI realizes that the banks have an appetite to lend at this particular point of time. There could be a reduction in interest rates along with further TLTROs coming through. Now, the TLTRO, the number 2.0, which the RBI spoke of, is interesting for me for one particular reason. Because all the time we had these targeted long-term repo operations, we were just talking in terms of lending first. Second, they spoke of lending the bond market. Now they've actually mentioned about NBFCs. So actually, what stops the RBI from actually targeting specific sectors in future? Because I think the number of sectors which we have spoken of, which are going to get affected quite negatively on account of this pandemic, will be looking out for relief packages from the government. And to my mind, it's not possible for the government to start giving funds from the budget. They have not done that in the past. I don't think that's going to happen. And the only way out is to have specialized programs where the banks do some kind of lending. But I would expect that maybe going ahead, depending upon the RBI's assessment of the overall manufacturing situation or even your services sector, I'm quite sure the aviation industry or maybe your hotels industry requires certain kind of funding in the form of a package. It's quite possible that the RBI's TLTRO could be targeted to specific sectors, because I think this NBFC is a very good example. At the very first time, they've specified a certain sector, so therefore this could be expanded to cover other sectors too. Overall banking sector, we don't expect bank credit to pick up in any sharp way. We're still looking at a number of 5-6%, nothing more during the year. Because it's not quite sure how it would behave, because I think the RBI has also lowered, not the RBI, the government has lowered the small savings rates. Banks have also started lowering the deposit rates. Under these conditions, there's definitely an incentive not to save money. But all this would only mean that there would be less surplus funds with the banking system. But today we're talking about like 4.5 lakh crores in net terms. So this is probably which could get affected, but may not really affect the overall system. That there could be problems in terms of NPAs for banks. It all depends upon how this delicate situation or moratorium and what really happens after the moratorium, how that is handled by the banking system and the RBI. I mean, logically, it looks like that there will have to be certain extensions made, because companies are able to service that on March 31st or on April 30th. In the face of a lockdown where there is no activity taking place, will definitely not be in a position to service their debt on 30th June or 1st July, the date would be. So therefore, I think we could expect further relaxations being made by the RBI, but again, generic ones, or whether it would be across certain. Last thing which I would like to touch upon is the exchange rate. I think the exchange rate is something which has held, I would say, fairly well. and they're still looking at a region of around 76, 77. And what is really heartening is that if you look at India's balance of payments, they're very, very strong. And when we talk of balance of payments, I'm actually referring to the fundamentals. So the fundamentals are definitely very strong. Look at the forex reserves, which is always a good number to look at because all the inflows and outflows put together leads to your changes in foreign exchange reserves. They have been very, very high, $475 billion or so. We've been adding to it because of a lower trade deficit. Even though there are certain amounts like your IT receipts, software receipts, which could get affected, your remittances can get affected. We have seen the FIs being positive, negative, generally negative. FDIs continues to be positive. So under these conditions, I think the rupee is going to be driven more by external factors. When I say external factors, they're the extraneous factors. So that's what happens to the dollar. The dollar will continue to strengthen, notwithstanding the fact that I think America is the country most affected by the pandemic. But there are also expectations that the economy would be in for a rollback of this shutdown faster. I think President Trump is very, very determined that things should get back to normalcy very soon. But probably that's one of the reasons as to why the dollar still remains very strong. And when the dollar is strong, the rupee also and other currencies tend to weaken. That's one of the reasons why the rupee has been weakening. Because I remember when the shutdown was announced, and we were discussing among ourselves, because then we felt got some views that the rupee may cross 80 to a dollar, but I think today it doesn't really look much likely because as long as the fundamentals remain strong, the fundamentals becoming strong, as I told you, it's more because of the economy not doing well, imports down, trade deficit improving significantly, which means the current account deficit comes down very sharply. It's because of a negative reason they're having a positive on our fundamentals. But any which way, this means that the rupee will continue to remain in this particular region. I don't really think it's going to depreciate.
Hello. Probably we have lost the audio of Madan sir again. I'll just try to reconnect. Could you please hold on?
Yeah.
Hello. Hello. Madan, so you're able to hear us? Hello? Hello?
Hello.
Sir, you can talk now. We can hear you now, sir.
I finished now. If anybody has a question.
Yeah, hello, dear participants. Sorry for the inconvenience and thank you for your patience. I think we'll begin our Q&A session. There's some severe network problem at Madan sir's end. So there are a couple of questions which you have written. Probably I can read it out and so that Madan sir can answer it. So you're able to hear me, sir, now?
Yeah, I'm able to hear you. Yeah, I can hear you, please.
Okay. So we have a query from Mr. Rajiv Saraswati is asking what are the implications for immediate and long term on the private banks?
See, as far as private banks are concerned, I think I would not distinguish between private banks and public sector banks. I think when I'm talking of the issue of NPAs, which are likely to increase, it holds for all companies and all banks. So I don't think there's any difference. I'm just talking in terms of this pure pandemic. I mean, we're not talking of any other factors. Will the pandemic be affecting private sector banks differently? The answer is probably not. It would be similar for both sets of banks.
Okay, sir. And the continuation query of Mr. Rajiv Saraswati is how does SME business cope up with this COVID-19 crisis?
See, the SME business is probably going to be the worst affected because we've seen this during demonetization and also GST. Because I think the SMEs have witnessed A, exodus of staff, B, the activity coming to an end, and C, all their payments also getting held up. Because we're looking at most of the SMEs which get linked with the primary companies. Any kind of a shutdown from the top level also ricochets to the SMEs. So I think the SMEs are going to have probably the toughest time. And I would tend to believe that even in terms of the RBI or the government package, the SME as a group is probably going to be the next sector after NBFCs, which are going to be looked at more closely. Now, which way or what are the modalities will, of course, be anyone's guess. But the SMEs have been definitely, and they will also take a longest amount of time to stand on their feet. The larger companies will be able to take in this shock for 1 or 2 months, which has already been witnessed, but the SMEs will definitely not be in such a position.
Thank you, sir. There's one more query from Grishma Goel. She's asking what could fiscal slippage mean at this time? And do you think inflation is an issue for our economy?
See, if you're looking at fiscal slippage, we should remember that when I'm talking of the fiscal deficit now, combined deficit going to say 10% from 6.5%, this will mean there'll be a lot of government borrowing taking place in the market. Now, one should realize that for 2021, the government had been drawing a lot from the NSSF, that is the Small Savings Fund, in order to finance the budget. Now, we had something like 2.4 lakh crores, which was taken for 1920, and a similar amount for 2021. Now, with small savings rates being reduced, I think that incremental NSSF is going to come down, which means that the government will have to necessarily borrow more. So the gross borrowing program of the government will be more than the 7.2 lakh crores. Now, will this be inflationary? The answer is obviously it is going to be inflationary because if I'm talking of a slippage of say another 3.5% to 4% of GDP, it means there'll be that much money in the economy. And given the fact that so far inflation has been more on the supply side rather than on the demand side, spending so much of money, what we have seen even post the Lehman crisis is that there will be a lot of demand pull inflation, which may not come in 2021, but subsequent years are going to be tough because we're going to have higher inflation at that point of time, in which case the RBI will also have to take a different kind of a stance, monetary stance, than what it's taking today.
Thank you, sir. There's one more query from Mr. Ratish Kumar. He's asking, we are getting different news about China picking up production and few reports claiming further slowdown in Chinese manufacturing base. What is your view as China is a main supplier to many of the industries in India?
If you're looking at China, see, one of the reasons as to why Chinese growth is going to be lower than Indian growth is that China is an export-oriented economy, and as long as there is a slowdown in the global economy, and if we're talking of a 3% recession, meaning degrowth in the world economy, so China's economy is definitely going to get. If you look at China-India relationship, I think we import more from China than what we export to China. So I think if Chinese imports, I mean, right now it depends upon what kind of a stance is taken by the government, as in when we decide to open up imports. But I think one will have to be a bit more cautious to make sure that Chinese goods are not dumped in India as in when we open.
So the continuation question is from Atish Kumar is, there's always a threat of rating downgrade for the country. S&P has already maintained that the outlook is negative. With the expected fiscal deficit widening, how are you going to look at the downgrade threat?
See, if you look at the nation's national or the sovereign rating, which is there, to my mind, in this kind of a pandemic situation, logically one follows a strict rule. Every country, right from the United States to India, will have to be downgraded. But that is not going to happen because I think the pandemic is going to be looked at a one-off incident. It's a kind of a black swan event which never was witnessed earlier. Given the fact that even it's not India saying that we are a better performing economy, say that India is going to do still register positive growth. I don't think a very high fiscal deficit, because even our high fiscal deficit of say 10% may not be interpreted very negatively by the rating agency. So I do not look at an immediate downgrade in terms of sovereign rating of India.
So there's a query from Grishma again. She's asking what measures can act as a buffer for the economy right now?
As of now, I think most of the measures which are being announced by the government and the Reserve Bank is for survival rather than for growth. So what you're talking about buffers, I think exactly what the government has done is a social security buffer. What the RBI has done is a kind of a buffer for all the companies which require funds and for all the people who are indebted. I think they have provided a buffer saying that they're giving a moratorium. So I think all the policies of the government and the RBI which have been announced so far are a buffer for survival, definitely not a kind of a buffer for growth. About growth, we'll just make sure we don't collapse further.
Sure, sir. I think we'll take up the last query for the day, which says that why the food inflation is projected at 8 to 10% when there is a good crop this year, which would reduce the supply side constraints.
In fact, the reason why I'm talking of food inflation is primarily on account of the fact that our supply chains have gotten terribly affected on account of the shutdown. So while production has been very high, wastage has been very high too, in the sense that I've not been able to deliver it. The transportation system has not been working, so a lot of foodstuffs, especially horticulture, has gone waste. If you're talking of the hotel industry closing down, I mean, that's going to be more severe because they're one of the largest single consumers of agricultural products. It's going to take a much longer time before they come back to normal. And I'm talking in terms of the entire supply chains, in terms of your transportation, your storage, your labor, everything that is involved to deliver these goods. There will be shortages at least up to September, which is going to keep food inflation up. So we have to distinguish between production and consumption. India is producing a lot and have GDP growth. So this is the anomaly which will be there. That, for example, I don't have access to lots of food products because they are not reaching me. Production recording, it's always there, it's been high. So this kind of an anomaly is going to lead to higher food inflation.
Sure, sir. Thank you, friends. That was the last question taken up for the day. There are a couple of more queries which we'll try to definitely revert on email. No sooner the webinar end, there will be a suggestion box coming in your mailbox. So if any further queries are there, you can please write to us. And thank you again for your patience. And we hope the webinar was insightful and look participation for future also. Thank you, and apologies from Care Ratings again. Thank you.
Yeah, apologies from my side also for this frequent disruptions.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mehul, sir.
Yeah, thanks, man. Thanks. Bye, Mehul. See you soon.